Students are often confused by negative angle identities. The trick to understanding negative angle identities is to think of negative angle identities as fourth quadrant angles. So, for example, if we draw an angle in the fourth quadrant, we'll call that negative theta. Then we know that the cosine of an angle in the fourth quadrant is positive, because the cosine of an angle in the fourth quadrant is a positive x over 1. So therefore, the cosine of negative theta equals a positive value, specifically the positive cosine of theta. And looking at secant of negative theta, since that's equal to 1 over the cosine of negative theta, and we've just shown that the cosine of negative theta is positive, then 1 over a positive value is also positive. So the secant of negative theta equals a positive secant of theta. Continuing on, we have the sine of negative theta. Again, looking at a fourth quadrant angle, the sine of negative theta would be negative y over 1, which is a negative value, negative y. So the sine of negative theta equals a negative sine of theta. Likewise, the cosecant of negative theta is equal to 1 over the sine of negative theta. And since we've just shown that the sine of negative theta is negative sine of theta, then it's a negative value. So the cosecant of negative theta equals a negative cosecant of theta. And last but not least, the tangent of negative theta we know is in the fourth quadrant equal to negative y over positive x, which is a negative value. So the tangent of a negative angle in the fourth quadrant is equal to a negative value, specifically a negative tangent of theta. And of course, the cotangent of negative theta is equal to 1 over the tangent of negative theta. And since the tangent of negative theta is negative, then 1 over a negative value is also negative. So the cotangent of negative theta equals a negative cotangent of theta. Let's look at a couple of examples. So we're told that the sine of theta equals 1/2, and we're asked to find the sine of negative theta and the cosecant of negative theta. Well, the sine of negative theta, if we interpret that as the sine of an angle in the fourth quadrant, and we know that the sine of an angle in the fourth quadrant is negative, so the sine of negative theta equals negative sine of theta. And since the sine of theta equals 1/2, and we have a negative in front of it, then negative sine of theta equals negative 1/2. If we look at the cosecant of negative theta, we can rewrite that as 1 over the sine of negative theta. And again, if we interpret the sine of negative theta as a sine of an angle in the fourth quadrant, we know the sine of an angle in the fourth quadrant is negative. So sine of negative theta equals negative sine of theta. And since we know that the sine of theta equals 1/2, that's given to us in the problem, times a negative, then the answer is negative 1/2. So 1 over negative 1/2 equals negative 2. Let's look at another example. Here we're given the cosine of negative theta equals negative 1/8. And we're asked to find the cosine of theta and the secant of negative theta. So in finding the cosine of theta, we know that the cosine of theta equals the cosine of negative theta by our negative angle identities. In other words, if we look at the cosine of negative theta, the cosine of a negative angle, or an angle in the fourth quadrant, is positive. So therefore, it's equal to just the positive cosine of theta. Since the cosine of negative theta is given to us in the problem equals negative 1/8, the answer is negative 1/8. Now let's look at the secant of negative theta. The secant of negative theta can be rewritten as 1 over the cosine of negative theta. But the cosine of negative theta is given to us in the problem. It's equal to negative 1/8. We can just substitute that in, and 1 over negative 1/8 equals negative 8. Go ahead and pause the video and try this problem on your own. Here we're given the cosine of negative theta, and we're asked to find, we're given the cosine of theta equals negative 2/3, and we're asked to find the cosine of negative theta. So let's start with what we know, the cosine of negative theta. We know that the cosine of an angle in the fourth quadrant is positive. So the cosine of negative theta equals a positive cosine of theta, which is given to us in the problem. Cosine of theta equals negative 2/3. So the solution is negative 2/3. In the next problem, we're given the secant of negative theta. We can rewrite that. Secant of negative theta equals 1 over the cosine of negative theta. And the cosine of a negative angle is a positive cosine of theta by our negative angle identity in comparing to fourth quadrant angles. We're given the cosine of theta in the problem is equal to negative 2/3. So we have 1 over negative 2/3. When we divide by a fraction, we can multiply by its inverse. So the solution is negative 3/2.